Welcome to L'Arte Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. Today's guest is Greg Mele. Greg has been studying Western martial arts for almost 30 years. He co-founded the Chicago Swordplay Guild, co-owns Freelance Academy Press, and started the legendary Western Martial Arts Weekend. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate being here, Josh.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. It's an honor to have you. Um, so you've been doing Western martial arts for really over 30 years, because I know that you had said that you had done a little bit of sport fencing before you started
Mhm.
into really getting into Western martial arts. So tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in Western martial arts.
Sure, sure. So the official story is that, and it's a good one to tell because we're just past the anniversary of my dad's passing, and so the official story is that I always blame my dad for this because he was the person who started me as a young kid watching Sunday afternoon family classics with Errol Flynn movies and all these different swashbucklers, Tyrone Power and all that.
Oh
So I
yeah.
grew up loving all that stuff, and from him, he had grown up reading Sabatini novels and all of that. So it definitely comes from him. And he was the one who made me like my first wooden swords when I was a kid, and so it was from my whole childhood. It was a thing about wanting to know how knights fought, and I have very misshapen knuckles, far less from HEMA than from my friends and I prior to high school, cutting down our hockey sticks and making them into swords, and
Yeah.
and wearing like really good safety gear, like our winter gloves, because that was to protect our hands, and bicycle jousting with 3-liter bottles on the end of a stick and saucer sleds that we strapped onto the handlebars, and yeah, so there's some really good moments that hopefully my parents never knew about. But anyway, so in high school I started sport fencing, and because that was sword fighting, right? Of course, it turned out not to be, but that is what it is. And I also joined the SCA when I was a little bit before my 16th birthday. And I did that for about 15 years, something like that, till just before my 30th birthday. So so I started in those circles, and of course, at the time, I was told in both of them, well, we don't really know how they fought back in the day. It was pretty clear sport fencing wasn't it, and nobody in the SCA in those days made any bones about the fact that they didn't really know what they were doing. It was a recreated activity. Um, so when I went off to U of I started. I dropped sport fencing and I took up Aikido because I thought it would really help with my body mechanics. And so I did Aikido and Kendo um, while I was in college, and I was still in the SCA. I was the local group marshal, and U of I has this incredible research library. It's like 10 million volumes or something like that. It's after the Library of Congress and Harvard. It's the largest research library in the country. So, um, so I screwed up my major. I was a double major, journalism psych, and I dropped psych and realized I had picked up so many history credits that I was like this close to getting a history major, right? But what I didn't really check was when are the classes you actually need to graduate available. So it turned out that no, sticking around an extra semester was going to be a whole year because I had to wait till the following spring. So I was taking like just enough classes to keep myself my full-time student status, so I didn't have to start paying loans. And I mean, I took a class on like Norse sagas and translation, right? I mean, like I was taking some pretty fluffy classes. So I had free time, and I had access to this library, and I started digging around, and I found a copy of Castle in the undergrad library, and he of course listed all these books, and it turned out that the rare book room had Degrassi and a few other things that I could look at, but of course I couldn't take out and I couldn't really read. And but they had a copy of Matthey's 1899 edition of Silver sitting in the stacks, and it had last been checked out in something like 1955 or something.
What?
Yeah, like no one had checked it out in like 40 years. So
Wow.
I promptly checked it out and went and photocopied the whole thing. And I was like, holy crap, here's this guy in 1599 talking about sword and buckler and bills and quarterstaves, and it's still not quite knights, but it's closer. And So that's what we started with. And we started, some friends and I started working with silver. And then I found three Elizabethan fencing manuals, which had it in there and also had Degrassi. And so, in those days you had a hodgepodge of everything. So anyway, that was kind of how it all started. And then the shift towards Italian stuff came in the mid 90s, when Stephen Hick hooked me up with a copy of Fiore, um, along with a really ugly, gross translation that had been done for the guys at the Royal Armories. I mean, it was clunky. And this is the Pisani Dosi, but it was something. And my family's Italian. My dad spoke Italian fluently. I had spoken it as a child and forgotten, and I realized, oh, I guess I'm just going to have to like learn how to read this.
Yeah.
And so that was how it started. And then along the way, all through the 90s, I did Tai Chi. I discontinued Kendo. I did a Koru Jiu-Jitsu style for a while. I did Toyama, Ryu, Batodo or Iaido, depending on which line you talk about. But I stopped, all of that stopped in 2000, and I just moved strictly to Hemo. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, the Chicago Swordplay Guild, I mean, you guys are legendary in terms of the content that you guys produce. I always use you guys almost as a metric to kind of base, or at least test my interpretations against. Sometimes if I read through Manciolino, I'll go back and I'll watch you guys' interpretations of Manciolino or Dallagocche or
oh,
whatnot.
well, thank you.
Yeah, I love using it as a reference, mostly because one of the things that I've seen that you guys have done exceptionally well, um, is integrating the complexity of your footwork and keeping your footwork historical, but also fighting with a level of earnest that meets what a lot of times we see in HEMA. And so that to me is something that I aspire towards, because you know you can get by, I think, in the HEMA community with just kind of learning the plays and not necessarily getting into the real body dynamics of things.
Hmm.
But I think that that's something that you guys take and just really kind of crank up to 11, and I really appreciate.
Well,
So
thank you. I don't know if I quite get to 11. Certainly Rob Rutherford does.
yeah, yeah, he
He's
definitely does.
Yeah, yeah. He definitely does. And but footwork's something we're pretty obsessive about. And you're right. I mean, we're doing this as modern people, often in modern floors and modern gear, et cetera. So it's very easy just to use good general athleticism. I mean, you could put a Bolognese sword arm on an Olympic fencing chassis, as it were, and the person would be quite effective. Would it be historical swordsmanship? No. It'd be historical-ish.
Yeah,
So, and yeah, right. And that's not what we're really interested in here. So,
yeah. So how did you come up? I mean, you co-founded the Chicago Swordplay Guild. Tell me a little bit about it. How you guys kind of came to that and
sure.
started.
Well, I'm going to do something that is so rare. I'm going to say something nice about Arma. So,
Okay,
although it was called Haka in those days. So, I
this will be
mean,
the first.
yeah, I know. It's especially coming from me. So the early days of the Haka website, it was really the only, other than Bill Wilson's E-List group, the old Rapier L listserv group, and the old classical fencing listserv group. Those were really the only places to discuss this stuff. Even prior to the old sword forum. And so there were a limited number of places to find people. And essentially, by this point, we're late 90s. Clement's book had come out, and so some people had learned about this stuff from his two books. I guess they were both out by then. And I had a couple of friends. We were working with Silver, Fiore, Talhofer, whatever we could find. And I had I saw a post from this guy, Mark Rector, saying, "Hey, I've got three friends in Chicago. We've been working on Rapier, and I'm working on translating Talhofer. And this is the old Green Hill edition of Talhofer that's been available forever."
Yep.
And he said, and I found this incredible park in Chicago, auditorium. It's the largest indoor park facility in the city. And at that time, the neighborhood was being kind of reclaimed. So he said, they'll let us train there for free as long as we make our classes open to the public. So it's like, holy crap, we have a
Wow.
giant indoor training space on like the north side of the city for free if we teach, So yeah, so we met on the day after New Year's, 1999, and January 2nd. And so he had three friends and I had three friends, and that was the creation of the CSG. It was as simple as that. And we just kind of started working from there. And like anybody else at that time, it was a mishmash of influences, etc. We made the shift to an all Italian shop in 2001.
Hmm.
So for 20 years now, we've been focused purely on Italian martial arts. And when we started really doing Bolognese, this is funny thing is that if you had asked any of us in the 90s, like, what are the texts that'll get translated right away, right? Like the guess at that time would have been Meyer and Marozzo.
Hmm.
They were both really famous. They're
Yep.
both huge, and they, I mean, famous in the sense of like literally for, for generations, people have talked about these two works. They're both huge. They have tons of weapons. And and of course, we just now got a complete translation of Marozzo, just what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Jarek's
Yep.
book,
Yep.
right? And so, so we all thought that would have been right around the corner. And oops, but yeah, so we started Bolognese as being part of our curriculum around 2007. Um, and really, my first teacher in that would have been Tom Leone and Steve Reich, who really, Bill Wilson was one of the other early pioneers, but really those two kind of really started looking at it and working with it. And yeah, so about 14 years now on the Bolognese side of the house.
Yeah, that's awesome. And
Yeah.
that's one of the big reasons why you're here, because we gotta settle a couple matters,
Okay,
because
sure.
you have the background in both Fiore and Vadi, and also in the Bolognese system, to help sort of suss out and answer some of the questions that are starting to arise in terms of how we're looking at Marazzo. Um, so there are a couple of different ways to approach Achille Marazzo and his two-handed sword section. And um, one of the things that I've found in my study, at least in looking at other people's interpretations, and I love what people are doing. There's a ton of interest in Marazzo's two-handed sword, but it seems like there's been a little bit of a trend to kind of allow KDF to influence the way that people are looking at Marazzo. And
Mhm.
I don't quite see that. When I read the text literally, and I know you can't always, especially with Marazzo, read Marazzo literally. I don't see a lot of KDF actions. I understand why people are reading KDF actions into it,
Mhm.
but it's not really what I'm
Yeah,
seeing.
yeah, I mean, look, you could also, read in Nichiru, you know, Kenjutsu actions if that was the tradition you came from. I mean, it's a two-handed sword slash a two-handed stick, right? You
Mhm.
could read in Eskrima actions if that's what your background was. So people read in what they know, and so I agree with you on that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true.
Yeah.
So,
So I think one of the biggest things that leads to this, and this is a question for you because I think it's something that you can speak to, and this is something I've been rolling around in my head. I haven't quite fully formed a good interpretation for it. It's just an idea that I've had and that I really want to kind of start to examine. Um, but looking at Filippo Vadi in particular, one of the things that people tend to do is they'll take Marazzo's cut a falso dritto that enters, right? And they'll
mhm,
say, okay, I'm going to cut a falso dritto that goes into Guardia de Entreri, right? So they
mhm,
turn that into a Shielhau. I don't think that that's correct. And I think that Filippo Vadi actually gives us an answer to that with his Posta Breve,
mhm,
because what Filippo Vadi says is if you were to cut he says that, let's see, pull pull it up here on Wiktenauer. I've got two different translations, and Guy Windsor's translation says something along the lines of, "This is a good guard to take after you've cut."
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what, while we're talking, I have mine sitting here. So why don't I, my actual translation. So why don't we make it 3, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, and I always feel bad because people always say, wait, you did one? It's like, well, yeah, we published it all the way back in 2001 and it's been out of print for years. But I am going to do a new one. But okay, so we want to look at Posta Breve, right?
Yep, Posta Breve. So Guy Windsor says, "I am the short guard of the extended sword. I often strike and recover into it quickly." I've got another translation, the one that's printed on Lulu Press, and I don't know who did this translation. It says, "I am Posta Breve of the extended sword, often cruel with the turns and cutting." I'm not sure if that's from different sources, but those are pretty wildly
Yeah,
different
it would have to be because the Italian
translations.
is son posto breve di spada lunghezza, spesso ferisco con le torno in frezza. So that just really means I'm the short stance of the extended sword. I often strike and quickly return.
Yes, and so that's that phrase right there, "I strike and I quickly return," is what I think that Marazzo is talking about when he says you enter. I think that if you were to throw a falso dritto or something like that, it is a falso dritto, as then it's a rising cut, and you're pulling back into Guardia de Entrare.
So, I mean, possibly. I think here's the bigger issue. People, let's start with the whole KDF thing, right?
Okay.
Is that first of all, a falso dritto is a false edge cut from the right, and it's a rising cut. So the German cut's a descending cut, right?
Hmm.
And so let's even take it a step further back. First assalto, first action, literally first action. So you're in Guardia di Testa, and you enter with if I forget if there he calls it a
A falso
falso
impuntanto. Yeah.
impuntanto, yeah, right to the temple. Okay, so same exact action is in body, and it's actually in a play that people have a terrible time interpreting. It's the very first illustrated plate. But if you take a look at the first plate where everyone's trying to make it into this weird false edge action, all he's showing you is a reverso. And we know this because he specifically described it earlier in the text. And I've written about this. But essentially, he wants you to enter with a reverso. And if you look at the chapters that precede it, he then tells you to turn a false edge thrust to the temple.
Hmm.
So, right, so Mandrito, so essentially a reverso fendente, or in Bolognese terms, a reverso squalembrato that then turns into a falso, right?
Hmm.
So now that's how he's getting there. Marotta just has you go straight to the falso, right?
Yeah.
But what guard are you in at the end of it? You're in Guardia d'Entrare. And so for body's idea, the legs are paired. So I've made this action. The very next thing I do is turn my hips and snap them and Drito to the other side.
Hmm.
Now, if you look at Marozzo, what does he do? He enters with this false. He enters with this action by falso. He takes a step out to the side, right, with this longer weapon, and he makes his redoubled mandrito. But in both cases, where I'm going with this is that first action is simply meant to use the speed of a thrust and the fact that a false edge action hooks around a guard to make a person chase the sword wide to
Hmm.
cover their outside line.
Yep.
Really, the real target has been the inside line the whole time.
Right.
And, so you're not trying to slip in past his guard and hit him. You're making essentially an action that sneaks in to get him to chase something. And it's a very Italian solution. I also do a little Italian stick and knife. These are living traditions, and they do the exact same sorts of things with the knife and the stick. In fact, the footwork looks really, really Bolognese. And remember, these are like folk traditions where if you talk to some of these old Sicilians and start talking about Achille Marozzo, they'll literally say things like, "I don't know him," because they'll think you're talking about some living guy. They're like, he sounds like a northerner. They have no idea who you're talking about.
Well, they're kind of right. Yeah.
And right, exactly. And but we see similar advice, for example, in Fiore, similar types of actions where with the boar's tooth guard, and he has two. So his advice, one is to attack comes up the center line, but the other, what does he specifically tell you to do? He says there's two ways. One is how the boar fights, and one is how you fight the boar. And so he wants you to step out to your left and throw a thrust from below,
Mhm.
right, to draw the attack. And when they go to parry, you then yield and cut fendente to the arms. So, and then return with a thrust again.
It sounds
Um,
pretty familiar. Yeah.
it's right. It's very familiar. You've seen this action in fact, Morozzo's a sequence for the sword alone, right? That
Yep.
we did. Remember, we had the contest early on in the pandemic that Rainer came up with.
Yep.
Those whole actions out of Boar's Tooth, or out of, in Porta de Ferro Larga in Bolognese terms, those are basically Fiore's instructions from the Boar's Tooth. I mean,
Yeah.
identical. So yeah, I don't think you need to chase across the Alps looking for things. I think it's all in the Italian tradition, and there's an Italian way to move and act and behave. And part of it is this love of actions from below, from low
Mm.
guards. I mean, think about it. What is the guard that every KDF person relies on? Vom Tag,
Mhm.
you know, and as much as the Bolognese have Guardia Alta, as soon as you switch to Spada de Filo, which guard disappears?
Yeah.
Guardia. I mean, in fact, Morozzo doesn't even bother to illustrate it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think there's.
right, the two most common guards, Guardia Alta and Guardia di Spalla, and he doesn't illustrate them.
Yep. I know of one play, and it blows my mind, of
So,
a Gordy Alta with Sword Alone, and it's in the Anonimo, and it's just one play out of his 460, and I think he just threw it in there because he just felt like he needed to cover it.
right,
Or they.
right, yeah,
I don't know.
exactly. So, it's not that they don't have them, but they're positions that you move through. I mean, obviously, Fiore has his Posta di Donna, which is Guardia di Spalla. But
Yeah.
to my mind, one of the things that we see very much about the Bolognese is that these kind of, high guards are far more transitory than in other arts, and they're very rarely starting positions. So,
Yeah, and that's, there's I think Gordia de Testa, because I think a lot of people tend to focus primarily on the first assault of the two-handed sword. They kind of miss the forest through the trees because they're
mhm,
just looking at the first assault, and they kind of, and those are all wide play actions, right? And
right.
even with that first setup, with when you start in Gordia de Testa and you come in, you cut, or uh, you do you feint the falso impuntanto. That action, that setup, is the reason why he tells you to do that is because your opponent is in Porta de Ferro Larga. And if you look at book 3, when Marazzo is talking about how to attack from Guardia di Testa, and he gives you all those actions from Guardia di Testa,
Mhm.
um, he actually tells you that you want to do Guardia di Testa against somebody who's in Codalunga Stretta, or is also in Guardia di Testa. You don't want to do it against somebody who's in Porta de Ferro Stretta. So what we get with that first action is a provocation to get that person to leave their guard, right?
Exactly.
Because they're in a good defensive guard, and we need to get them out of it. Um, and so I think that without the full scope of understanding, people are like, okay, well, this is what I need to do, when that's not actually the guard that you are anticipating somebody to be in. And you're throwing this provocation that's just simply to get them out and to sort of disrupt their guard.
No, you're spot on. And the funny thing about that is, think about the guard Porta de Ferro Stretta, right?
Mhm.
And plug it into the context of the Bolognese tradition at large. So think about Manciolino, right? What is the only guard he has you use for his Spada Solo? Porta de
Porta de
Ferro
Ferro
Stretta,
Strata.
right?
Mhm.
And for Vigiani's Perfect Schermo, even though the first play begins with what the traditional masters would call sotto il braccio,
Mhm.
once you've done that universal parry, he then recovers to what is his equivalent to Porta de Ferro Stretta. I mean, I know it's Guardia Difensiva Professa, blah blah blah, but really, it's Porta de Ferro Stretta. So the point is that those guards give you this universal parry that the Bolognese love.
Mhm.
But what Morozzo's doing there is, he knows that. I mean, he knows that's what it does. So what he's doing is he's making a feint that is essentially designed to get them the hell out of that position, out of their strongest defense.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with you about the assaults have to be taken in context. And the first assault by itself, if that was all you studied, you've you've really missed his lesson, because think about how you constantly fly out with this falso to the hands, right?
Hmm.
Because you constantly have to fly out. And but remember what Marozzo tells us about, if you don't know the gioco stretto. If you don't know the gioco stretto, you know half of the art. And
Exactly.
he's showing you this here, because he constantly is compelled to go back. And I think I told you, Josh, I did a little um, lesson when we were in lockdown for my students. I'd have them film stuff, and so we could train. And one of the things I did was I took parts of the first assault and I said, okay, well, here's what Marozzo teaches. Here's how Fiore might do it. Here's how Vadi might do it using their guards, etc., and some of their blow preferences. And the biggest difference when I gave the example of the Fiore action was that it was constantly pushing in, constantly driving in, because Fiore has a couple of times that he shows retreats, but he's usually driving in towards the weapon side, towards the right side. That's a stylistic trait of his. Um, and so, I made the point that if you had to retreat in Armazzari, in Fiore's art, here's how the retreats would look. And people were like, well, it just kind of looks like Marozzo now. Well,
Yeah.
right, because in his plays, his first assault, he's just showing you how to get back out in the Largo. Um, but that doesn't mean this is all you're supposed to do defense. So,
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of a little how the Anonymous breaks down wide play and narrow play, um, where I'm gonna read this off here. So he says, if you wish to be a good fencer, then you must understand that if you are fighting against one that understands the narrow play, you should try to fight against him from the wide play. Then your talent will be confounded. Or if you try to fight against him in the wide play, your talent will be confounded, right? So he's saying that narrow play is always going to sort of trump wide play.
mm-hmm,
But then he goes on to explain, if you wish to use a full array of techniques and guards and all of your understanding, then when you run across a fencer that fights in the narrow play, then you will act as though you plan to fence in the wide play and then astutely strike him from the narrow play. And so, too, if you find a fencer that fences from the wide play, you should act as though you intend to fence from the narrow play, but strike him with an attack from the wide play. And that right there almost summarizes exactly what Marazzo is doing, where you're acting like you want to fight from the narrow play, and then you're hitting them in a wide play, right? Even with the exit, where you're kind of sending that falso to the hand,
mm-hmm.
you're kind of like bunching them up, and you're giving them these like really tight attacks, and then you're kind of pulling out. And then um, if you look at book two, or the second assault, um, what you end up seeing is a lot of these actions where most of his narrow play actions that he gives in the second book are preceded by a provocation or a some sort of an embellishment, right? He does these really elaborate embellishments to try to
Mm-hmm.
get your opponent, like you're gonna go in wide play, right? You're doing these big sweeping actions, like you're sort of feinting wide play, and
Mm-hmm.
then that gets your opponent to come in narrow, and then you give a narrow counter.
Yeah, and and the thing is, right, when we talk about wide and narrow play, or wide and close play, and I use the term close when I talk about play, and narrow when I talk about guards. Um, because of course the anonymous is the one who makes the big deal about your points being in presence, right?
Right.
But
Yep.
of course, if we end up forte to forte, our points can't possibly be in presence, and yet
Yep.
we are clearly in close play. So, so without going into there, the thing I'm making the point of is that the Italian language is works differently than the English language does. We create a new word for everything in English, basically,
Yeah.
and we layer meaning. So, essentially, you can take a narrow guard in wide play. You can take a right. You can't really take a wide guard, however. Um, but I agree with you. What to my mind he's trying to get at here is that when I'm in the wide play, I can use full blows. I can use sweeping motions. Right. I cannot do that. I have to use half cuts. I have to use thrusts in close play,
Hmm.
which inevitably then sooner or later I'm only fighting in close guards, and sooner or later I'm at the half sword. And we know that the half sword is the delineator. And
Yep.
so if you look at the first assalto, look at what constantly happens there is that you get these big sweeping motions that almost deny a mesospada crossing until the very end. And then I get there, I do something, and then I fly out. And I fly out with things that are meant to constrain another term, right? Um, that constrain what the opponent can do. And so, to my mind, that's sort of the tactics that you see in Morozzo's two-handed sword, is that there's these kind of large actions that I break measure off of that are deceptive, that are meant to make you yourself wide spaced, right? To pull you out of a narrow guard. So look at the very first sequence. He's in Porta de Ferro Stretta, right? So it's a narrow guard. His point is in line. Mine is not. I'm in a wide spaced guard. So what do? I make a thrust that pulls his point out of that line.
Yep.
Now I can throw a cut, and it's two cuts, one of which is a full blow. So something happens. Either he parries and I break it, keeping us in the wide play or whatever. But the idea there is that, he's making a choice to use these large actions there to pull me out as well. And that's very different than, for example, what you see in the second assault.
Yeah.
Right. Or the third. So I think that people forget that the assaulti are pedagogical lessons. They aren't necessarily, little fight sequences you're supposed to expect to look just like in a fight. He's trying to show you different kinds of play and how to apply it. And it's a very sophisticated pedagogical lesson, but you got to treat it like a pedagogical lesson.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think that's great too, because I think, in some way, I could follow this up with another Anonymous quote, but I'm not. I don't want to just read off the entire Anonymous here, because he essentially gives the exact like that's his perfect summation of how to conduct wide and narrow play actions. Is, if your opponent's point is offline, you work to get it online so that way you can take it offline. If if their point is online, then you'll work to get it offline so that way you can strike them safely. That's just my summary of it. But
right,
like,
and again, that's perfectly in keeping with what we see in the Armazari tradition as well. The point forward guards are considered to be probes, and their whole purpose is to get someone to try to chase them, to displace them, right? And so, I want to pull you out of your guard, and when I do that, then you're susceptible to a cut or a thrust. So
yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to sort of take this, is how do you view Vadi and Fiore as really kind of informing Marazzo? Because when it comes to Marazzo, sometimes I feel like, because he's writing for Sebastian and we don't necessarily have the core fundamental material that he's assuming that Sebastian is probably well versed in and knows how to teach, um, sometimes we get these holes in Marazzo where we have to fill it in with something. One of my favorite things to do is to take like Manciolino and his sword and large buckler material, and then let that feed into Marazzo and his sword and large buckler material, or his sword and target material, and I feel like I really understand it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we don't have another like two-handed sword system that can feed into Marazzo. So like how do you take that with Fiore and Vadi, and how do you sort
Sure.
of let that inform Marazzo?
Sure. So, there's a couple of things there. First of all, they're definitely interwoven systems, right? So you can use different parts of Marozzo to answer questions in Marozzo. So you can use sword alone to answer two-handed sword. You can use sword and buckler. I certainly, and I'm going to get to your question, but you can also, I do want to say that one of the things about Manciolino is that, so the common wisdom for years, right, was that Manciolino and Marozzo were both trained by De Luca. And certainly they know each other, because Manciolino is obviously taking a piss at Marozzo when he talks about masters who put prices up on their wall. There's no doubt. But also, like, look at their first assalto of the sword and buckler, and it's so similar. It's crazy. It feels like I said, I had a background in Aikido. if you look at the guys who trained with O-sensei, the founder of Aikido, a lot of them, took things a little bit this way, a little bit that way, and there's differences, but it's all still Aikido. So they're clearly kissing cousins, even though Moncellino doesn't have two-handed sword. And I mean, he clearly knew it. He references it.
Yeah, he talks about it.
Right, and of course, the anonymous is super frustrating because all he has is the
Just the
half
straight
sword
up.
place,
Yeah.
and so the rest is got destroyed by the vagaries of time. Um, so yeah, so he'll give you Strato, and of course the man was obsessed with Sword Alone. I I also sometimes am like, do you really want me to do this? Like, is this just an exercise, or are you like batshit crazy? Because some of those plays are like,
Yeah.
and leap in and cut at his ankle, then leap out. And it's like, you out of your mind? So I mean, he is definitely a kind of balls to the wall kind of guy compared to the other Bolognese. But anyway, so you're right. So first of all, we can extrapolate from different parts of the system to try and other writers to fill each other in. So that's where I would try to start, and that's where I do always suggest people try to start, is try to look within your immediate circle. Um, but I have this that oh God, what the hell is the name of that book? Oh, I have it sitting here, as a matter of fact. The Meditations on Hema Mind Changer, and I did an article in there about what I call concentric rings, which
Mhm.
is sort of how do you research your art when you don't have answers. So when you've got a guy like Morozzo who keeps saying, as you well know, or as I have taught you, and you know, and then of course doesn't explain, um, how do you look earlier? So here's my thought. Um, there's a common vocabulary between the Bolognese school and the Armazzari tradition of Fiore. Um, Bologna and Ferrara are separated by, maybe 2 days ride on a horse.
Mhm.
Um,
And I bel
Morozzo was teaching in Modena, or had some connection to Modena, owned land there, where it's entirely possible one of the copies of The Flower of Battle lived, and he even named his book The Flower of Arms. So before, that's just a pet wild theory. I'm not saying that he actually had Fiore's book,
yeah.
but what I'm getting at is that there's clearly a common martial culture floating through northern Italy that we're glimpsing darkly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw in a quick historical anecdote here too as well, because didn't after Guido Rangoni lost control of Bologna, after he was no longer um, in charge in Bologna, didn't the Duke of Ferrara become the head of Bologna in the Papal States?
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, there's even more of a a sort of a stem there that connects Ferrara and Bologna. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I mean, the Este are one of the huge powers of Central Italy.
yeah, oh yeah.
And Bologna spends part of its history kind of being the thumb in the eye of the Papal States' kind of ability to try to coalesce everything. So there's a history there that is a martial history there that we only partly understand. But my point is that this idea that, like, and one more thing I should point out, we don't know that Fiore himself was even ever in Ferrara. There's not a single data point that shows that he ever was in that city. Um, I have reasons to believe that Vadi was, and that he saw the manuscripts there, but not Fiore. And so, so when Fiore was writing for Niccolo d'Este, was he in Ferrara? Was he in Modena? Was he in Parma? Was he in Reggio? Was he not there at all? Was he up in Milan and sent this book as a gift? And we don't know. Um, but regardless, a there's obviously an Italian conception of fencing that
Mhm.
is going on, and that is drawing from common terminology. And and Fiore himself tells us that he had books on the art and had read books on the art. So I don't think Porta de Ferro is unique to either one of these schools. I don't think the idea of Cinghiaro is unique to either of these schools. Um, so once the way I handle it is, once, like, looking at the other parts of Morozzo, there's no clear answer. and Moncellino and the Anonimo don't necessarily provide a clear answer. Then I go backwards, right? And I think it's always better if you can go backwards than forwards, because, trying to look, say, for example, at Delagoche to answer a Marozzo question, they're within a tradition and a generation. Okay, but what if I find myself looking at, say, Salvatore Fabris, right? Things have
Hmm.
changed a lot now. Things have
Yep.
changed a lot now. Whereas things haven't changed nearly as much between Filippo Vadi, who's a contemporary to De Luca,
Hmm.
and Marozzo. By the time Vadi's writing his book, Marozzo's alive.
Right.
Boy, but he's alive.
Yeah.
So, so that's how I try to approach it. And by the same token, if I can't get an answer out of Fiore and Vadi, I go looking to Marozzo before I necessarily go looking to, say, Peter von Danzig. Um,
Yeah.
and you might have to make that decision. You might have to go say, well, what does Meyer say about this? Um,
Yeah.
you might find that, but I don't think you need to, and I don't think that's where you should start, because I think there's a definite Italian style of fencing, and it is different. There's just certain assumptions. Just as soon as you move away from the idea of actions being codified in guards,
Hmm.
you've taken on a different way of looking at the fight,
Yeah.
and you
That's
can't disconnect that from the Bolognese school.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's why Vadi is so heretical. Or, I mean, not
Right.
Vadi, but um, oh shoot,
Vigiani,
Vigiani.
Vigiani.
Yeah,
Right, because and yet, right, he, and yet he's a big freaking hypocrite, because he says that
and then gives you like 15 name or 15 word long guard
for
names.
the exact same damn guards, and
Yeah.
provides the best primer in the art on body mechanics.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but
No. So
yeah, he says there's guards 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then never calls them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 again. He comes up with just more names that are just as
offensive.
cumbersome as the old ones.
Yeah. 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 That's actually something that through my research of just the tactical and strategic outlook of the Bolognese system, I started to realize how important the guards were to the way that everything really coexists with each other. Like, if you look at the overall framework of how you're told to approach a fight, you're told to approach by varying your guard as you come into measure, and then once you're at that edge of measure, you identify what guard your opponent is in, and based on what guard you're in, you proceed with however you know to break that guard and sort of take advantage and gain control of the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think of it that way, everything is so guard dependent. And you look at Marazzo's advice on like his middle section, which I like to call progression through the guards, but it's just that one
Yeah.
section where he kind of gives you each guard and then kind of everything. Um, and even in like Michilino's first chapter, where he gives you how to attack from every guard, like you can plug that into Marazzo, and you can get a really good framework of what Marazzo is talking about. Because Marazzo
Mm-hmm.
says, learn to just cut and defend against everything in this guard. He doesn't actually explain how to do it; he just tells you to
Right.
do it. And then Mancilino actually gives that advice. But like if you look at that as a framework for how to think about the Bolognese system strategically, because that's how they teach, right? Like. Even Dalagoke gives you the different guards and the provocations that you would do against somebody. Of course, he's matching guards, where with somebody like the Anonimo, one of the things that the Anonimo gives us that we don't necessarily get is a little bit more of what do we do if we're, or sort of guards that are not similar. So like
Yeah.
he's thinking a little bit more advanced, like a lot of times he'll have you with a left foot forward if your opponent's right foot is forward to sort of get that leverage position and stuff like that. But um, I agree with you that's sort of the framework of Italian fencing, like being in a guard, recognizing the guard, and countering the guard, and really kind of coming in. And then you add in sprezzatura, and you're just like, this is you got to do it with a little bit of panache. And you got to make it beautiful because it's
Yeah,
Italian.
exactly. And like if you look at modern Italian knife fighting, you'll see what looks like, as these guys are practicing, what looks like an awful lot of walking and embellishments, right? Where
Yeah.
the knife is moving and it's twirling. And of course, And it's not because they're just trying to look cool, although I mean they are Italian, so there's a certain amount of wanting to kind of look cool,
Yeah.
because that is actually part of the aesthetic. But part of it also is that, it's this thing is, as I'm keeping it moving, et cetera, is wondering which position it's going to come to. And what's interesting is even in the knife, the positions are called wide and closed.
Mm,
So there's an open position where the knife is up and back, and then there's a closed where the knife is in position here pointed at you,
yeah.
right? So wide, closed, just like
Nice.
the picture behind me with sword and buckler from 1400.
Yep.
Okay,
Wide and
right,
closed.
right, but with a folding knife, and and so but as they move and you look at the footwork, it is these combinations of spiraling steps and half steps and cross steps that are very familiar. And the idea there, though, is that by understanding these positions and how to move in them and how to hide the transitions to them, that's how you enter the fight and you approach the fight. And then you always move out in kind of a dynamic position that is either under the cover of a thrust or is with a little hop, right?
Hmm.
Or is with a little embellishment. And that again is very similar to what we see in the assaulti, where you either often fly out with a thrust or some kind of combination of cuts. You know, Morozzo tends to have you do a little step out. Manciolino likes his little hop, right?
Yep.
But again, you can see that, and so I think that those characteristics are part of what makes this Italian.
Yeah.
In
And I mean, like if you think of like a magician, right? It's sleight of hand. And
Mhm,
what makes a good magician that can do sleight of hand things, um, the whole trick to it is constant motion that disguises your intention, right?
mhm,
And that's exactly what we're doing, but we're doing it with a sword. So
right,
we're essentially not declaring our intention as we come in, but reading our opponent, and figuring out a way that we can press them to our advantage. Um,
right, and we're lying, right? I
oh yeah,
always joke that a fencing match is like a bad relationship
yeah,
because it's completely selfish. And I'll lie to you, I'll deceive you, and then I'll leave you. And but it's true, and that's what I think a lot of what we see in the Largo is the Largo is those deceptions.
mm,
The Stretto plays by nature tend to become somewhat more direct and aggressive
mhm.
because the time is small. The
Yeah,
space
exactly.
the
You have
space
to
is
be
small, and
winning.
therefore the
Yeah,
time is small, right? I'm at the mezzospada, so I have no choice. And so the point there is that, and the way I think the Italians conceptualize the fight is that the Largo is where I set everything up so that when we get to the Stretto, this fight becomes very definitive very quickly. And whereas if I just simply, and I think that's what the Anonymous was trying to get at, whereas if you just take the Stretto and I take the Stretto and I just come into you, as Fiore says, the danger of the Gioco Stretto is that what one can do, the other can do.
hmm,
And
yep,
so because there's parity, we can see that. And if you think about it, um, look at Del Agoke in the transition to rapier, right? Del Agoke starts moving, like you said, towards, okay, so you are in, Coda Longue Strata, and I am in Coda Longue Strata, and therefore and it's very, very much a parity. And by the age of the rapier, they dropped the notion of Joko and switched to Misura, purely Misura, because essentially we're always matching our guards, and we're always, every time someone lunges and I parry, we're in the Joko Stretto.
hmm,
So it's not a really useful distinction anymore.
right.
The play always has that characteristic. So they moved him just talking about Missouri. You know, am
Yeah,
I?
and I like that. I like that Delagoke also in that, and I mean, he talks about that transition and how he thinks that the fencing of the ancients, as he calls it, which is another diss at Marazzo, calling him old.
Yeah.
Just, he says the fencing of the ancients is, there was a lot of wide play and that it's beautiful, right? Like he says, if you want to fight sexy, you use wide play actions, and wide play is sexy, but the fencing of his day is very narrow. And of course, if you look at his contemporary authors at the time, I mean, the Roman system is pretty much completely taken over, in terms of naming guards and positions and things like that. Um, And it's pretty fascinating too, because like you still get like when I was talking to David Biggs and we were talking about the Vienna Anonymous, um, there still seems to be a little bit of this sort of using wide play guards to sort of confound your opponent and just kind of
Hmm.
like dropping into wide play or wide guards, excuse me, not wide play, but wide guards, to sort of disguise intentions and things like that. We see that with Palladini, um, and
You
other authors where,
you see it with Fabris, right? Where
yeah,
he takes his rapier and he puts it perpendicular to the line to set up a
yeah, yeah,
universal parry into second. But it's essentially it's a smokescreen, right?
yeah.
He's trying to make you think, what the hell is this guy doing? And and it's yeah, we still it doesn't just disappear. I mean, Capoferro maintains Vigiani's universal parry, you know, from quarta into prima, and little bits of it persist. So
Yeah. Yeah, and then it's just it feels like there's a a core that we can look at and really sort of pull these things out of without having to extend ourselves so far that I mean obviously there were Germans, there were Spaniards, there were English um in Italy well throughout the 1490s into the mid 1500s. And the question is how solidified at that point was the style of sword fighting that we would have to say, like, were they really so confounded by these invading people that they would sort of convert their sword fighting to match? Um, or is it that they had an existing system that just sort of evolved over time, and as warfare changed, or as combat changed, in small groups and even in interpersonal combat, um, is there something of a legacy that we can see, that we can draw upon, that we can just sort of lay out and say this is where we need to focus?
yeah, and I have to tell you, like you said, scary thought as it is, I'm at like 30, almost 30 years now of doing this stuff, which is making me feel very, very old. But I started off, of course, in the early days, just buying into the arguments that, kind of the nationalistic arguments that a Castle and a Novati and um, a Vossmendorf, et cetera, had, and then we kind of all sort of rejected that, and all these stupid Victorians, and they didn't know what they were talking about. And the funny thing is, like literally this morning, I was just finishing translating all of Novati's footnotes for the latest in my Fiore series that I'm doing, right?
Mhm.
And um, it's amazing how many things he was already onto that we all think we've discovered. He had already figured out that there was a copy of Fiore in Paris.
Hmm.
He hadn't been able to find it, but he knew it should be there. And it took Ken Manshin to find it in what 10 years ago, but in 1904 he knew about it. And but the other thing that's interesting is that yes, these guys had things that they missed on, and they certainly had the nationalistic politics of the early 20th century kind of blurring things for them. He
Mhm.
loves to talk about how much more developed Morozzo is than the German texts, for example, and therefore Fiore, although is very flawed, at least he prefigures the brilliance of Morozzo as opposed to the crudity of the Germans. So you get that kind, you get that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And But having said that, these guys were living in a world where fencing was still being practiced, and was really still at the very end of its being used for duels and even on a battlefield. Um, and they often are quite a lot more accurate about things than we give them credit for, in just terms of looking at the characteristics of how these guys think about their fighting. And so I've kind of come to a reconsideration of these late 19th, early 20th century authors. And to that, you know, they're the thing they all hyperbole aside, um, the thing they're not wrong about is that there is definitely a way that German fencing masters approach their art, and talking about their art, whether it's the 15th century, the 17th century, or the 18th century. And the same is true about the Italians.
Yeah.
And like I said, learning more about the stick and knife traditions that are living traditions in Italy, um, really brought that home, because you just see it, and you see there's a certain way to move, a certain way to retreat, etc. And so, yes, martial artists are pirates. They see something that works and they steal it, but it still gets stolen and imported within the milieu of that person. You
Hmm.
can't escape who you are. And there's an Argentine tango and English tango, and they're both tango. But boy, you can tell which one is developed by Latins and which one was developed by Englishmen.
Yeah, and that's
You
that's
know,
really interesting because I think that there's almost a language component too. Like if we look culturally at the German culture, which is a high context culture, and the Italian culture, which is a low context culture, in that,
mm-hmm.
typically the Italians will give you 100 words for one one idea, where the Germans will give you three, right?
Right,
That's
three
for those for
smashed
those
together.
exactly. For
So,
those of you who don't understand what low context and high context cultures are, that's kind of a brief summary of what that means. And yeah, the Germans do smash it into one word, and it's like 45 characters long. So, um,
right, right,
but
but like for the fencers on here, right? Zwerkow. Okay, so there is there's a German term. Moncellino has the exact same thing in his sword and buckler like 3 times. And what does it take for him to describe it? I want you to make a false edge cut that will move along the line of the mandrito tondo, turning your hand so like he has to literally describe it for you,
mhm,
because it has no name.
yeah,
So he has to work it all out for you. And the Germans go, gosh, I use this a lot. I'll just call it a cross cut or a thwart cut or whatever translation you
yeah.
want,
I
but I'll
think I
call it
think
a
cross
Zwerkow.
crosscut is coming back as
I thank
the
God.
accepted term.
Thank God. Thank God. So, you know, and
Yeah, no, and with a lot of the Italian text, I think Dall'Agocche is a great example of this. It's a conversation. You have
right.
you have a muse that Dall'Agocche uses in Lepido to explain everything, and he writes
Mhm.
it out like it's a play, and he's explaining these things to him. And
Yeah.
then you have these deep humanist like introductions to everything in Manciolino.
Oh,
That
right. Well, who complains that he can't show you what a great writer he is because he has
yeah,
to talk about fencing? I mean, he literally complains about it. And
yeah.
then you've got other people like Pagano, who is like, yeah, screw that. I'm going to write a metaphorical make believe ducal court, and the fencing displays are going to be how I teach you about fencing. And then his son is like, oh yeah, hold my beer. I'm going to write a deep metaphorical, thing filled with literary allusion that is so frickin' over the top that I don't know if there's actually a word of fencing advice in there. If there is, it'll take someone better than me to pull it out. But yeah, and so it's it's a very different way um, to approach how to talk about a physical discipline in words.
Mhm.
And but see, for me, that's what's part of what's cool. And I'm not interested in doing Mick Euro swordsmanship. I'm
Yeah.
interested in these traditions as traditions. And it's like when people say, oh well, so you do Italian longsword? No, I do not do Italian longsword. I do armazzare, or I do Bolognese fencing, etc., which includes the longsword. And that's what you lose if you don't try to do that. You know, so
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to look at it. I mean, and you know, I guess again that kind of brings back that challenge of Marazzo, but I mean, I think you laid it out well in terms of how to look at this from concentric circles, right? And you know, with other things, if we wanted to look at single-handed sword, I mean, if you need to figure something out with single-handed sword, now that we have an English translation of the Anonimo, I mean, you can find some explanation of what it is that you're trying to figure out, even if it's batshit crazy, but
yeah.
you can get an idea of how this would have been done, right? Where with the two-handed sword, we don't necessarily get that with Marazzo, but there are Italian traditions where if you are looking for something that fits the Italian bravado and language and style and overall just cultural norms, you have something that can help you to really kind of identify what prompted these actions. Why are we doing these things the way that we're doing them? And I think
Yeah,
that's important.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is, we can never know, right?
Yeah.
But as and this is a joke, but it's one of those jokes that's true. You know, no one does Marozzo. I mean, the last person to do Marozzo was Mrs. Marozzo, right? And so, but I mean, seriously, we say that as a shorthand, but what we do is we do a reconstruction of the school of,
Hmm.
and that's okay, because you know no one does Osensei's Aikido, no one does Yip Man's Wing Chun, right? They I'm friends with a very well known English Wing Chun guy named Samuel Kwok, who has literally spent decades training with all of Yip Man's students, his two sons, his other senior students, trying to reconstruct, like, what did this guy teach?
Hmm.
And the reality of it is that Sam would tell you that all of these guys teach something a little different, emphasize different things. Some teach 4 forms, some teach 3, some don't even teach the forms. And he's tried to put that together and synthesize that. But in the end, it's still going to be Samuel Kwok's
Hmm.
Wing Chun, and that's okay. You're going to do your version of the Bolognese tradition, and I'm going to do mine, and they should be close enough that we can see the the family resemblance, right?
Yeah.
But we just have to accept that, is that um, when we plug in these answers, what we get is what may be correct, and but we can't know because we can't interview them. So what we have to do is we have to try to figure out, okay, what solutions, what frog DNA, right, is most likely to get me a correct answer. And just by definition, you know, good science tells us the further you go from the source to import outside data, the bigger the chance of error.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it may come down to, you're like, wow, I was watching this Salat demo and I had this realization, or I was watching a Chinese sword demo and I had this realization, and it might be totally legit. And it doesn't mean like you shouldn't be willing to open yourself to that, but you probably shouldn't start there if, like, Fiore and Vadi could provide an answer,
Yeah.
you know?
And that, I think that's interesting too, because like in the KDF system actually highlights this really well. If you look at Ringek, Dobringer, um, Yudlev, all of them have their own take on this of the Zettel and the poem that they're sort of interpreting.
Mm-hmm.
And you see stylistic differences between those different authors, just like we see stylistic differences from all the Bolognese authors. Like we're kind of looking at a century of time where this was prominent and important, and it was something that obviously was popular because we see a lot of text built out on it. I mean, Marazzo was a New York Times bestseller, like platinum.
Right,
Like
right.
if you think about the dispersion of his book, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, so somebody with some sort of a background must have said, "Hey, this is actually worth looking into and holding on to." I mean, I don't think it was just, Marazzo was, the best marketer of the 16th century. Um,
He certainly
and
wasn't the best writer. So
exactly, and that's
I
that's
mean,
kind of what
I
I'm
mean,
getting at. So
let's be honest. The guy's actually a terrible writer.
yes,
I'm a man of few words, as he then goes on for like 2 pages before he gets around to what the hell he wants to teach you. So yeah,
but that's the point. So he's
yeah,
not a good writer. It's relatively confusing. It's not structured in a way that makes a lot of sense, like let's say Manciolino's is, but it was still incredibly popular. So what can we read into that in terms of just saying, why was this so popular? Because obviously people saw value in it and they thought it was actually worth something. Is it just because of the pictures? Like, is that the only thing that really made it interesting was the woodcuts?
Right.
I don't know.
I mean, look, clearly, clearly, if we had any doubt, we just saw in the last week that Meyer clearly thought it had value, right?
Yeah, but yeah, so yeah, that's actually where I was hoping we would transition to, because
Yeah.
he learned fencing and he knew fencing from a lot of different places. He says that he traveled, just like in 3227A, it says that Lichtenauer traveled far and wide to learn the art. Myers says that he traveled to learn the art and
Right.
that he
And,
learned
and,
from.
and Fury says the same thing. Although I sometimes wonder if, this isn't sort of like in Japanese martial arts, these guys going up on a mountaintop and like, achieving enlightenment, or the Tengu came and taught them. I
Yeah,
traveled far and wide, which means like I went to Luigi's house down the street, and I went I mean, we don't know, but yeah, but regardless, right? Whether Meyer really traveled far and wide or bought a bunch of books,
right.
he clearly was a trained fencer who had impressed enough people in a military society that at the time of his death, he had just, landed a really good gig for himself,
Yep.
and was writing for progressively more and more prestigious students.
Mm,
Um, and clearly, clearly was something of a fencing prodigy. I mean, he's only, I forget, I'm not a Meyer specialist, but he's what, like 30
yeah,
thereabout when
he
he
was young.
dies.
Hmm.
He's very young when he dies in 1570. So, and he's already created three different treatises.
Hmm.
So, obviously Morozzo wrote his book before the man was born.
Right.
There's and then there's the 56 and the 1568. So, whatever version he saw, it doesn't really matter. It clearly inspired him, and you can see that in how he decided to reorder kind of the pedagogics or the didactics of the German tradition. Talking about moving from guard to guard, creating these long training sequences that include a withdrawal, which you don't see in the earlier German material.
Mm,
They get you to the half sword, and then they take care of business, and that's kind of the end of it.
yeah.
Um, and so, but again, it speaks to the fact that the man's on the other side of the Alps, and clearly Morozzo's book showed up
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah. Well,
So
I mean, we know at least that one of Marazzo's senior students was a German, Giacomo Crafter, right? Um,
right.
he So I actually found a really good source on the Crafter family, and they were merchants that worked for the Fugers. Did I say that right? And they were um, sort of like their whole business was shipping textiles, which relates even better to Marazzo, right? Starting a textile mill
Yeah.
um, across the Alps and one of their cities that they were constantly importing goods from across the Alps was Bologna. Um, and the thing that I find really interesting, like if you look at Marazzo's dagger section, he says, "To you, Giacomo Crafter of Augsburg, and you, Giovanni Battista del Lete, um, as my dear sons and students." Right. So these are obviously senior students. He's calling them his sons. Right. So I
Sure.
I I would assume, and I could be wrong, that these are his senior students. These are guys who spent a lot of time with him, and were with him for a long time, if he considered them sons, because I don't see why he would call them that if not. Um, so that you will remember me, I will give you advice on numerous presse with the dagger, so that should circumstance require, you will be equipped with what you need to know to defend yourselves. Thus, occasionally deign to review these presse, and remember me, Achille. Um, in the said presse, I will present to you as best suited in my writing, so be attentive in order to commit this to memory, which I will begin with subsequent section, Jesus, Mary, Virgin. Um, and so one of the things that I think, I can't remember if he says later on, he says that they had specifically requested these things of him. I'm not sure if I covered that in that first paragraph, but I think it's pretty fascinating that you get this. But Giacomo Crafter, we already have a well-known German student that's obviously very sort of akin to Marozzo, somebody that he was willing to call his son. Um, and there's a clear and maybe it's just the university relation, because the University of Bologna was such a big university that you would have people that would travel, and Marazzo's connection as the Master General of Arms in Bologna, that you would have these sort of deeper roots that would spread out. Um, I'm not exactly sure, but it's clear that he was teaching a multinational sort of audience here, and that he had a lot of students. So I'm not sure if that helps with the dispersion of these ideas, getting out and getting across, and really kind of building up his popularity or what. But it's definitely an interesting footnote.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, we know that we know that Italian fencing masters became increasingly in demand, and really, especially in the 17th century, obviously. I mean, Fabris basically is the guy who sticks the stake through the heart of the Leichenauer tradition
Hmm.
in its homeland. And you've got German masters for the next 200 years debating who teaches the true Salvatoran tradition, right?
Hmm.
But I'm sure that part of that was the popularity of the Italian universities, and it would be great if we knew exactly what the hell Morozzo's title that he has for himself meant. Like, what does that mean? And was he also teaching at the university the way Darty was, two generations earlier?
Hmm.
Um, and we don't. But whatever the case, I think the two things we have to remember is that people in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance traveled a hell of a lot more than we give them credit for. Like,
Yeah.
maybe not the average turnip farmer, sure, but people of the urban and upper classes certainly did.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, the printed book really did change everything. And it is amazing how widespread sometimes these printed books crop up in a world without Amazon. So,
Right. Yeah.
you know, um,
Yeah.
and and yet they do. And so, yeah, I think the coolest thing about this new Meyer and showing the obvious lifts from Morozzo, um, artistic lifts, is that it just confirms that. And it confirms that here is a young guy trained in his own native arts who saw that and went, oh, wow, you know what? I can totally work this
Yeah.
into my own tradition and create something new. I mean, I think what's cool is that, like you said, all these guys always want to tell you like they traveled widely and they studied, okay, so here is a guy we actually know a lot about, Joachim Meyer, and we can actually see the process. Like, we can follow the manuscripts and see how it goes from him kind of cribbing. It'll be interesting when it's translated to see
Hmm.
how much it really feels cribbed, right?
Yeah, because this is his earliest, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And to by the time you get to 1570, which is his latest, and be like, where it's clearly
Yeah. And now
these
we see a
syn-
final tradition. Yeah.
yeah, and to fairness, if you look at his, his kind of straight parrying that he uses for the rapier, he's
Hmm.
almost a little bit ahead at that point, kind of prefiguring what rapier fencing 30 years later is going to look like, where it's a focus on an extended guard.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating, and it shows us both the popularity of Morozzo, and it also shows us kind of how the sort of the innovators of fencing innovated. So.
Yeah, yeah. One of the other things too that really strikes me, and this is something I'm really curious to kind of get a hold of, is we see images and ideas so far. We don't know the text that accompanies them, but we see things that are actually a little bit more, show a deeper understanding of some of the concepts that we now take for granted, like the Segno, for example.
Mhm.
Um, the way that he illustrates the Segno shows a deeper understanding than what you get from a surface reading of Marazzo. So my question is that something that he's reading into Marazzo the way that we read it and read it from Marazzo? So essentially he's doing HEMA in Germany, you
Right.
know, in the 1500s, or did he actually have a deeper understanding of how this Northern Italian idea of the Segno really played out? Because if you look at especially the image that I love the most is his image with the quarter staff, and he's got that cross step where he's stepping across and sort of giving that strong overbind. Um, that's something that we've been doing for quite some time, and as we practice around the Segno with our more advanced circular footwork.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if, is this Meyer having a deeper understanding, or is this just, yeah, what he's reading into it? I don't know. It's really fascinating because it seems like there's a lot of depth there.
Yeah, and again, here's two Italian guys, Italian martial artists talking about Meyer, right? But what's cool about his books is that he is one of the few people to write drills and whatnot in there.
Hmm.
And so the question is like, where'd they come from?
Yeah.
Are we seeing it, like you said, are we seeing an insight that he's had and created, and we're just, is it a carryover? Because for Marozzo, what we have that's really frustrating is we have a curriculum without the lesson plan, right?
Yep.
Here's the assaulti, but I'm not going to tell you how to teach the assaulti. Here's the assaulti. They're clearly meant to be done not only as a solo form, but as partnered sequences. But I only tell you the partner's role when it's something he absolutely must do.
Yeah.
And, and it's hard, and it's very hard. Um, but I don't know, for me, that's kind of half the fun is the detective work. Even if sometimes I will confess, and um, we just got done going through his polearm material,
Hmm.
which is far more straightforward than a lot of his swordsmanship. It's like as he gets to the later parts of the book, he got a little bit more succinct as a writer or something. But
Yeah.
but even then, you're like, so really, you have a name for every single freaking guard, and then here you come up with the guard and the other guard. So,
Yeah.
oh, and by the way, this one is Porta de Ferro e Largo, and it's like it just
Yeah.
or but then he gets to the lance, and because it's so long, it's such a long weapon, he's like, I want you to take 3 or 4 running steps out to your side while twisting your hands. It's like, you want me to what? For what? And it's like, where is he? Where is he? Come back. This is a partner drill. Where is the bad guy?
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's not that much fun, actually. Sometimes a little more specificity would have been awesome. So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we see, I don't know. I mean, we see other concepts. I mean, you could argue that Mancilino more or less describes what Meyer illustrates in the Meyer square. I don't want to get too deep into just like his
yeah,
Meyer Bolognese, but
yeah,
he says if you want to strike your opponent in his upper body, you should begin your action below. Similarly, if you want to strike him below, you should begin your operations above. This is because as one defends the parts being attacked, he necessarily creates openings elsewhere. And that, I mean, maybe it's a stretch, but if you were to actually illustrate that in some sort of a drilling action, you would create Meyer square, right?
yeah. Right, right. Yeah. No, that's interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. So
But yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't know. I'm excited to see if Meyer, with his knowledge of fencing, whether it's Bolognese or not, just the fact that we know that he was a skilled fencer, I'm excited to see him explain the Segno with his understanding of fencing in a way that may be deeper than what we see from some of the other authors, and see if there's something there that we can take out of it to help us understand Bolognese.
yeah, well, and that's the thing. I know there was this big description of, does this mean Myers Bolognese, and everyone wanted this simple yes no answer, and the answer is no.
Yeah,
Myers Meyer,
yeah,
and
exactly.
he
Yeah,
was he was an innovator who clearly was taking lessons from other arts and marrying it to his own. But you know what? I guarantee you, knew a lot more and grew up around a lot more people who knew what happened in real sword fights than we do.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that makes him really useful to us.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the first place I should jump. And of course, for something like the longsword, where he is clearly the most carefully trying to work within the tradition, because it's the ancient and honorable weapon of the German race, blah, 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 blah. As all these guys say, it probably doesn't mean that that's my first source to understand Morozzo, but he does give us a living mind inside of tactics and innovations and how someone else was reading and understanding Morozzo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think
So,
one of the things that I to sort of expound upon this further, especially with the Segno, the best explanation of the Segno and how to use the Segno is probably, at least for an English translation, I'll clarify that, is Docciolini. Um, Unfortunately, we don't have an English translation of Altoni, but I would I'm patiently awaiting, and I've tried myself a few times.
yeah,
Um,
good luck. It's hard. It's
yeah,
it's it's a hard
it is.
text.
I've yeah, trying to make sense of some of it is pretty wild, especially because my Italian is awful. But either way, with the Segno in particular, Marazzo just says teach your students to step around the Segno, right? He doesn't really tell us how to use it tactically. Docciolini kind of gives us an explanation of how to use it tactically. Palladini gives us a really good explanation, but he does it in a paragraph, right?
Yeah.
It's not enough to really kind of flush that out. And I'm really hoping that Meyer, even as an outsider who's looking at the Bolognese system, probably like you said, from having the text, is going to give us a better explanation of how to do that. And one of the things that I've actually been talking about a lot with KDF practitioners is talking about concentric circles. I know you said sometimes it's better not to look forward, but with KDF, their best explanation may be looking forward sometimes
Mm-hmm.
versus staying
Right.
within the
Right.
Lichtenauer tradition. They can't really look back unless they're going to look at I-33, which I could
Which is,
argue
yeah.
after watching Rob's class on first and second intentions, his provocations, his Bolognese class,
Yeah.
which is an amazing lecture, by the way. If anybody,
Well,
everybody should go check that out on your YouTube channel for the Chicago Swordplay Guild, because it was an amazing lecture. But that's that lecture actually, in my mind, helped me connect I-33 to Lichtenauer in a way where I was talking to Ben Strictly and I was like, hey, and he was like, actually, and we got into a pretty awesome discussion about sort of tying those two things together. But what I was getting at is um, with the Segno in particular, there is um, so Meyer, the fact that he has the Segno, the approach to measure could be argued as the Zufechten, right? And that
mm-hmm.
brings you to the edge of measure, which would be the outside concentric circle of the Segno.
Mm-hmm.
The second space, the space the in between to the next circle, would be the Krieg. And then that center circle would obviously sort of represent, as what I believe Palladini calls the misura di ferere. It would be the you know uh, sort of the area where you start going into presse and sort of wrestling at the sword. So is there a connection there where Meyer was like, hey, this is what I've already been learning. This is measure, tempo, the things that we use in the Italian language that a lot of times KDF people are like, that doesn't exist in Lichtenauer, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. Is Meyer looking at these things and saying, hey, these are the things that I've understand, and these are really important concepts in the Italian fencing, and now I'm pulling it into this to better explain to Germans what isn't
you know
necessarily there in Lichtenauer.
God, I would hope, because if there's anything that this community needs to understand, is that it really is all Aristotle, and
Yes.
a lot of digital ink could really end if people would quit trying to make vor, indes, and knock into anything other than just simple Aristotelian explanations of
Yes.
exactly what it sounds like. There's the before and the after, and the between or during, and that's all that tempo and mesotempo is. Um, but it's again, these are educated people relative to their world. And, if we quit trying to force them to conform to our world, um, we'll understand them on their own terms, and we'll go down a lot more blind alleys. I told you I started with silver, and like I have a rule that I absolutely will not participate in any discussion ever again that addresses George Silver, because the poor man could not have written a simpler text, and the amount of just the amount of ink spilled, when I can't tell you how many times like I've provided entire bibliographies of like Silver is quoting Aristotle through Occam, who was an Englishman who is the definitive source on Aristotle of the late Middle Ages, taught at every university in Europe, wrote at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor at the time Liechtenauer was writing. Like, there's no debate what the intellectual framework is.
Mhm.
But but, but who the hell wants to read a book on Aristotle? So,
Right.
but at a certain point, like if you really want to get in there, you either need to understand these people and the world they grew up in because they're educated, and
Mhm.
understand how the quadrivium and the trivium work, or um, you can make some shit up. And you
Well,
know,
yeah, and so I think that this is what's interesting when, and this is, I think, what a lot of people will dance around, and then, you're talking about sort of like a pan-European system of fighting. Like, when people make the argument for a pan-European system of fighting, there a lot of times they'll point out similarities between different systems, and they're like, well, why are these things all so similar? And the similarity between the only thing that is pan-unifying that I think exists in European martial arts outside of sort of um, you know I, I guess maybe divorcing it from cultural differences, and how they play into the development of sword fighting, is the fact that everybody's relying on Aristotle, right? Like,
right,
I don't understand how, like, I mean, if you want to understand European sword fighting, I mean, really, if from a fundamental standpoint, from a metaphysical standpoint, you could point all of your students to Aristotle, and you could say, start here and go into whatever system you want.
right, right. It's not some weird thing that Vigiani happened to quote at length because
Yeah.
he was trying to be an innovator. I mean, the whole point of Vigiani is he's not trying to be an innovator. He's arguing that fencing masters needlessly obscure a universal truth.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's true.
Yeah. And it's almost like he's saying, why are we putting so many curtains around this one simple thing, which is Aristotle's physics? Let me explain it to you, and then let me put window drapings on it again later on. But, you know,
Right, right. Yeah. And yeah, he basically is the 16th century example of Besançon, who wrote his book as a bunch of guys sitting around a hunting lodge, and this nobleman is Sentiments of the Sword is talking about, oh well, I've been training with my fencing master for years, and he's like, well, then you're getting screwed because fencing's really simple, and in 3 nights I could teach you to fence, and every day is a new lesson. I mean, Vigiani is the same sort of little heretic, right? Which is that
mhm.
it's actually very simple. um, and but I think the fact that he wrote that in 1590, Besançon wrote in I think the 1890s, 1870s, something like that. Um, maybe a little earlier. Anyway, 19th century, and here we are going through this again now. Just shows us something about people, is that we love to make things harder than they need to be,
Yeah, for sure.
and in the end, it's a monkey trying to stick a pointy stick into another person.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I know that we're getting a little bit long on time. So one
Yeah.
of the things that I like to sort of conclude with is the question: what is something that you think we as a community can do to better improve in reflecting the sources on our fencing?
Well, I think it's for me it's twofold. I mean, you talked about footwork, and said some nice things about our footwork. And I really think the first thing from a mechanical point of view is that we really need to spend time understanding that there is a body aesthetic to every martial art. If your goal is a traditional martial art, and not, just MMA with swords, then you owe it to yourself to figure out how they moved and why.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean you have to become, a reenactor per se, but it does mean you need to spend some time looking at the culture that produced these things, whether it's the artwork, the low stances you see for example, in a Meyer, or the very erect body carriage, that aristocratic body carriage of an Italian. You need to know, if you're doing Bolognese fencing, what sprezzatura means. If it doesn't look like your movements are effortless, right? And actually, sprezzatura really means disdain, to make something
Mm.
seem so simple that it seems, nonchalant, right?
Mm.
If you can't do that, then if it looks really aggressive and tense, you're not doing what they did. And I think that the more you try to get to that, you start to realize that it's not just an affectation. It's because they're also teaching you to be relaxed. And by being relaxed, you can be responsive in a way you can't when you're tense. And so I think trying to learn how to move the way they did, trying to understand how, a light shoe, a fitted doublet, which forces your body into a certain type of carriage, et cetera, how that affects the the human machine, actually does help inform the martial art. And so
Mhm.
that's the tactical or the technical thing I think we need to do. Um, I think that the tactical thing that we can do as a community is to understand that tournaments and fencing get-togethers, et cetera, are all important, and it's why we enjoy doing this as modern people. Um, but they only reflect a reality of what modern people and their contemporary athleticism can do on a given day. They don't reflect the martial art. And to try to understand the martial art, you've got to be willing to get past it seems to work when we spar.
Mm.
Because unfortunately, you and I might spend a long weekend working something out and be absolutely convinced, but it still may not fit what Morozzo said. And the problem is we don't have a Morozzo or a Sebastiano or anybody else to test it against. We only have each other. So the fact that it worked on us doesn't mean anything. And that doesn't mean you have to constantly reinvent the wheel,
Hmm.
but it does mean you have to make sure your wheel looks like a 16th century wheel and not a 21st century wheel.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because that in some ways defies a little bit of, I think, the sort of common consensus. So, but I definitely understand you in that, and I want you to expand upon that a little bit further
Sure.
because I know that a lot of people, and myself included, the way that I was taught was the framework to really kind of develop your interpretation, use various,
Mhm.
really kind of following like the Jake Norwood method, the of triangulation, and kind of using tournaments to validate against a sort of an uncooperative
Sure.
opponent.
So I did a whole series of lectures on training on our Swordplay online, and I think they're all available now so people can see them. And so one of the things I said is, again, people have this idea that the CSG is anti-tournament. We host a tournament here. We host it every January. Obviously, this last year we didn't. We held as far as I know, the first HEMA one at the very first WMAW in 1989.
Mm.
I have students who travel to tournaments. I myself competed in three different things and have a whole bunch of, various medals and trophies I gained over the years. Um, Tournaments, in my opinion, the one thing they absolutely don't do is tell you a single thing about your martial arts interpretations. Like, they are the absolute worst embodiment of that. They test your athleticism, they
Mm.
test your psychological preparedness,
Mhm.
and they test your willingness to test yourself against someone who doesn't necessarily care if they hurt you in order to win a cheap plastic medal. But that's literally what you're fighting for, are cheap plastic medals, and maybe some tournaments have a sword or something. And bigger the prize, the more people are willing to F each other up.
Sure.
But here's where I'm going with this. Um, and the more, and Jake and I used to go back and forth on this all the time. The tournament we run, our rules fit on one piece of paper, right? In terms of the scoring, the long point model with all the judging, et cetera, is something that I gave up on a long time ago because it's completely subjective and you can't actually make people fight cleanly.
Mhm.
Um, and real fights, if you look at real combat, it's not clean and it's not pretty. So, um, so consequently, before anyone listening to this gets the wrong point out of this, I'm not saying tournaments are bad and don't do them. Actually, quite the opposite. I think people should do them. They should compete. Because if you only fence people in your own school or your own way, or when it's just a friendly sparring match, you tell yourself a different lie. Tournaments test your ability to perform under psychological pressure. They
Mhm.
do not test your technological or your technical historicity or cleanliness. If they did, Olympic fencing would be the ultimate expression of épée fencing,
Mhm.
but it looks nothing like épée fencing, a traditional classical épée fencing, because the rules and the equipment of the art have allowed it not to, if that
Mhm.
makes sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, having said that, I got news for you. An Olympic level fencer is in many ways a far more dangerous athlete than anybody in HEMA. They're a fucking Olympian.
Yeah.
Okay. You
Yeah, they're
know,
incredible.
right. A world kendo champion is not doing kenjutsu, but in terms of their speed, their ability to fire under pressure, their ability to perceive an opening and take it, their control of measure, they far and exceed 99.9% of us. So, okay. So the athleticism of it is important. Um, the the psychological challenge is important, but here's the problem. Case in point, if it's a judged system, everyone sooner or later learns to play to the judge.
Mhm.
And by what I mean is techniques that judges don't see well, anyone who's smart cuts them out of their repertoire.
Mhm.
The judge can't see it, so why would you do it? There's a whole host of German techniques. When was the last time you saw someone effectively press the hands in a tournament?
Well,
You're
well,
right.
I mean, you've met Ben Strickling, right? I
Yeah,
mean, you know who he is. So
yeah,
he's the head of our
yeah.
school, and
Right, right,
as a matter of fact, when we host our tournament, which is a continuous fighting rule set, um, we a press to the hands is worth just as much as a hit to the head, and so it's encouraged for
right,
people to go for those techniques.
right.
But
And so
you have to tailor your rules to go for that sort of a
it,
technique, right?
it,
It's not something that you're just gonna.
exactly. And a continuous fighting system sometimes helps with that also because it allows certain things to happen, right? But
Yeah.
everything that my point is that every choice we make to create a rule is going to encourage certain things and not others. Like
Yeah, for sure.
we designed our rule set to just punish the living hell out of doubles.
Hmm.
So, it's real simple. You do X number of passes. If you win, you get a point. If you don't get hit, you get another point. If there's a double, both people lose a point. And those point totals is
I
what
like that.
dictates you're moving on, right?
Hmm.
And so sometimes people end up walking out of the fight going, I don't get it. I have a negative score. Like I'm now worse in terms of advancing than I was
Yeah.
before I fought. Well, right, you did everything wrong. So those things are good and they test a certain amount of things, but they don't necessarily test your knowledge of the art as a whole, because all things are true. I'm 50, right?
Yeah.
I probably have a higher technical knowledge than a number of my students. If it's a long, if it's a long round robin tournament day,
Hmm.
I'm going to gasp before them because I'm older. I'm 20 years older, and
Yeah.
that matters.
Yeah.
I have nerve damage in one arm and I have a bad back. That makes me a little bit slower. Someone who's a really good athlete who is half as well trained may be able to push through that. Those things are also relevant, but they aren't necessarily relevant for understanding how a martial art works.
Hmm.
And I had a student who I could never explain this to. He was 6'8" with really long arms. So his solution was, to basically snipe the top of people's scalps. And so, well, why isn't this just all you need to do?
Yeah.
And so he had to learn what a stop thrust into the throat when someone really doesn't care how hard they hit you,
Hmm. Yeah.
right, will feel. But so tournaments test a lot of things. They don't necessarily test your technical expertise. They do test your ability to pull whatever your core is out of, on pressure. There's a great article on the International
Yeah.
Armazari Society page that Christian Cameron wrote called The Metaphysics of Armazari. And he makes the point of, you know, to become an Olympic fencer, you need essentially 3 techniques you can do at an Olympic level,
Hmm.
3 techniques you can do at a sub-Olympic level,
Hmm.
and then a host of everything else you can pull out when someone has managed to beat all of that. And it's a great explanation of the mindset of how to develop technique for competition. Um, and that's important. But that's a little bit different than saying I'm trying to master Bolognese swordsmanship,
Right. Right.
if that makes
Interestingly
sense.
enough, though, well, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, Levino gives almost exact advice, right? Like he basically what he says is that if you're fighting somebody that you've never fought before, and you don't know how they fight or what their skill level is, that you should use constraining type actions and beats on their sword, right? And he
Mhm.
says you should never use falsata against somebody who you don't understand. And
Right,
you should use these beats and constraining actions until you have a good read on what their skill level is, so then you can start using falsata,
right,
right? So he almost has this hierarchy of how to approach a fight that he's never been engaged in. Um, and I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, in some way, my biggest frustration with tournaments is that most people just have absolutely no concept of measure. I've made it my mission to teach HEMA measure, or at least an understanding of measure, and that's why I'm excited about
oh
Joachim,
yeah,
because
oh yeah, and you're spot
because
on.
they just close in, and it's just like
Right. Oh no,
like
you're
they're
you're
magnets
absolutely
or something.
you're absolutely right. And it's the generic stereotypical hemo fight is 2 guys here. They do a little hop,
Uh-huh.
and then they go like this, and
Yep.
you see a lot of Zverkovs back and forth, back and forth, back and forth
Yep.
until somebody raises a flag.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean they might as well be boxing with swords. And
Yeah. And then
right,
they get mad. They get mad when people snipe their hands from that range. And it always cracks me up because I'm like, look, if you didn't walk into measure and just stop, they
right,
probably wouldn't have sniped your hands. But the problem is, and this goes back to a conversation that we had before getting on the podcast, where we were talking about gloves and people learning to protect their hands.
right,
If you don't want your hands to get hit, don't walk into measure and stop and just expect that you're not going to get hit in the hands, because if somebody knows what they're doing, you're giving them a perfect target at wide measure that they can just pop you in the hands and protect themselves without getting hit.
right,
I mean,
right.
it's
And by the
really
way,
the same.
that's really good fencing because if I freaking disable your hand, the
Yeah,
fight
you're
is
done.
over.
You're
Right.
done. Yeah.
So like, yeah. So don't get mad at them for doing the smart thing.
Yeah.
And no, it's absolutely true. And measure is a crucial thing. I guess the other big thing too that we could really afford to do better is second intention fighting.
Mm.
Um, is that so many people think that the key to get into a fight is throw your hardest, strongest blow as you rush in, and then that gets you in and you can do a thing.
Yeah.
And that's really simplistic. Uh,
Oh,
it's like, why did they develop all these feints and complex actions, etc.?
mhm.
Um, fence with all your strength doesn't mean be a moron. Um,
Right.
so, right, and so you put that with lack of measure, and you take all the fencing out of your fencing. So, and just the last part on tournaments. Part of the reason is the one thing we can't really simulate with a tournament, and you've fought in a number of them now. Early on, when I first used to do this, I used to get sick to my stomach the day of a tournament. I'd be nervous. You don't want to suck in front of your friends. But after you've done it for a while, you really realize that like it's just another thing. And really, unless you're going into like the last tier of the thing, the
Yeah.
vast majority of people, it has no one even knows you're fighting. It really doesn't. Maybe your wife cares if she's
Yeah.
there. If
Yep.
so right. But the problem is the thing we can't simulate is that in a real sword fight, you're going to be maimed or die. So the last thing you want to do is leap in and glue yourself to that person.
Yep.
And of course, the more we put more and more gear on, the less and less you're afraid of it. So back to what we said very early on in the podcast, there's this challenge, or maybe it's before the podcast, there's this challenge that I need the gear so that we can compete between schools where we have different ideas of what's a good hit. But if I put too much gear, then we also fight differently. And so we're constantly trying to figure out how to make this feel real. And I guess what I'm getting at is what we as a community need to understand is that none of these things, the forms, the cutting practice, the tournament, the friendly sparring, none of it is real. To do this art, you have to do all of it. So if you do it just to compete in the tournament, then you are just doing a sport. If you are doing all of these things to try to get to a higher truth, then you have to understand that they're all legs on a table. And no one is necessarily more important than the other. That's, I guess, what I'm getting at.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I think I've seen a really interesting evolution of seeing an older generation of people. Um, I'm not saying not to say that you're old, but
Oh,
um,
oh, that's okay. I'm feeling it these days. Yeah.
I've seen an older generation of fighters walk away from tournaments and really start to focus in on that sort of higher level study and really
Mhm.
trying to understand things from different concepts. Like, I mean, Jake Norwood just a couple weeks ago was out in the woods with Michael Chittister and, like trying to
Right.
figure out what it was like to be a
Right.
lance.
Right. Stuff. That years ago.
It,
Stuff years ago that Jake that actually not Jake. That's the funny thing. But years ago, that a number of people from that generation, which is really the generation after mine, used to roll their eyes at me over.
yeah,
Um, right.
but
And
it's the idea of trying to achieve that deeper understanding
mhm,
versus like
mhm.
it's almost a level, it's like a maturity is what it
Right.
is. It's understanding that there's more to what we're looking at than something like, like you said,
Yeah.
just fighting for
And
plastic stuff like that.
yeah. And it's a process. And it's a process. Young people want to compete, and I think they should, and I think it's good.
Yeah,
And then at some point, you also realize that like any sport, that favors certain things, and there's diminishing returns on it unless your purpose is the sport, just for the sport. And honestly, that isn't wrong either, as long as you just understand that. If that makes sense, if the person's thing is, look, I do I do modern longsword, and that's what I do, and I do modern competition longsword, and I could give two shits about all this other historical stuff. I don't have a problem with that. I just want you to be honest about it, and then that's cool. But we don't do the same thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And yeah, that's what I've seen a lot. You know, there's some people who've, especially I've seen lately, talk about sort of, and I don't want to, how do I phrase this? They've talked about creating their like own systems and things like that, and really trying to like develop something outside of historical martial arts, or even like achieving a certain level of understanding in historical martial arts where you could start to sort of formulate an idea of your own way of fighting. And when people say stuff like that, I almost think to myself, well, that's not Western martial arts. It's not HEMA. That's not really what we're really kind of getting at here. Like, I
Right.
mean, if you're doing something and you're trying to, I mean, I guess in some way, they're like, well, why would I look at the 400 plays in the Anonymous when I could just say, hey, this works for me, so this is what I'm going to do.
Sure, but that's not HEMA. That's mess. Modern European sword sport.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And I think that's
And
kind of what I'm getting at, because it may work for you in the context of competition,
right.
but you don't know if that would work for you in the context of a real sword fight.
No, and you
But
never will.
exactly, unless you're crazy.
Right. In which case, it still means nothing, because it means you will have gotten in a sword fight with someone else who knows nothing about sword fighting. Right.
True.
So,
Yes,
or you
absolutely.
murdered somebody, in which case we got a whole different issue. But yeah, so it's right. It's there's nothing wrong with that, because in the end, all of this is being done for your own personal edification, but it is different, and
Yeah.
people need to just accept that.
Yeah. That's a great point. All right,
All
Greg,
right.
um, let's go ahead and wrap it up there.
Yeah, yeah.
I I still have a million things to ask you and to talk about, so I think maybe I can get you on again sometime. But
I'm sure you could get me to do that. I like to pontificate, so you can get me to do that. And and I've
yeah,
been
no,
like everyone else. I've been locked in my house for a year, so any excuse to talk to other people. So,
yeah, absolutely. Well, it was great having you on. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
all right, my pleasure.
All right, bye.
Take care.
And that concludes another episode of L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. Thanks again to Greg for coming on and sharing his wisdom with us. That was a wonderful episode. I learned so much from him. I can't say enough about his kindness and his wisdom. Um, Definitely grateful that he came onto the podcast. Next week's episode is going to be a new segment. I know it's been a long time between episodes, and you'll have to forgive me for that. But next week's episode is going to be a new segment called Drinks and Darty, where I'm going to sit down and have a drink with Stephen Freitas, and we're going to talk about the Bolognese system in a much more informal setting. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.